So one idea that I just wanted to briefly go over before we left behind the idea of Christianity being the only way to God. Some people, we talked about pluralism on Wednesday, and the somewhat paradoxical things that pluralists and humanists have to accept when it comes to all faiths being equally legitimate or being tolerant of all belief systems. You inevitably run into a roadblock where you have to decide for yourself, well, am I going to be accepting and tolerant of a belief system that claims exclusivity? If I'm going to be tolerant of all faiths, well, what happens when Christians believe that their faith is the only true one? Or what happens when Muslims believe that their faith is the only true faith, the only true way to God? Can we be tolerant of that and still save face? And I think we talked pretty well about the difficulties of doing so. One other thing that you may hear people say, and I think if people say this, they really haven't thought about it a whole lot. It's kind of a saying or a slogan. What you'll find, we talked about this in this class at one point before. So many people go through life and they'll have beliefs about other religions, they'll have beliefs about their faith, but it's not really based on a close examination of any of it. A lot of it is based on just a feeling or just a slogan. And one of those slogans might be, well, all faiths are basically the same. Any religion that you believe in, it's some kind of God, it's some kind of moral code, but all beliefs are basically the same. And I just wanted to have ourselves ask this question a little bit. If you stop and think about that, does that really hold up at all? We briefly mentioned, and I wanted to go over again this idea that I think you can argue that most religions and most faiths believe in some kind of betterment of oneself, some kind of self-improvement. But becoming a better person is not necessarily the end goal of salvation. And that may be a strange thing when you hear that said. So think about that. Being a better person is not the end goal of salvation. Is that true or is that not true, first of all? Anybody take issue with that statement?
Yes.
Yes, you take issue with it, or yes, you do not take issue with it? Maybe both. What do I mean by that? Brace, are you reading my mind?
I don't take issue with it because it's not the end goal. It is a byproduct of honoring the God who is the creator and revealer of the end goal, which is ultimately us spending an eternity with Him. So I would agree with your statement. It is not the aim per se. There are a lot of people who try to better their lives who are not really necessarily doing it for God. And so, it's not the goal, but it is an inevitable consequence of seeking the goal.
Right.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
A self-fulfilling prophecy? Okay.
Seeking salvation makes you become a better person.
I would say that it does. There's the things that faiths can agree on is, aiming for some kind of moralistic standard. That's a pretty universal thing when it comes to religions, if we're going to call them religions. I suppose there's some belief systems out there that make it lumped in with religions that I would kind of debate whether those are religions as much as they are. Just off the top of my head, I wasn't planning on talking about this at all, but Satanism, okay? There is a modern movement of Satanism. If you talk to any of them, or if you hear them in interviews and hear what they have to say, most of them don't really worship Satan. It's kind of an ironic faith. It's sort of a cultural movement where it's a criticism of religions, and they tend to subscribe to, just do what helps people, just don't do bad to people, and do whatever you want to do. They call themselves Satanists and the Church of Satan, but they don't believe that Satan is as much a real character as they believe God is a real character. It's a critique on Christianity is what they're trying to do. And they just love it when news stations pick up, they wanted to erect a statue in such and such town, and it gets on the news, and they love it because they're trying to rustle people's feathers, and they usually succeed in that. I wouldn't call that a faith, but even they would say the goal is just be a better person. We're just trying to be better people, and we don't want religion to get in the way of doing that. But what do faiths disagree on? Did anyone look at what are some things that are just fundamentally at odds with one another when it comes to all these different religions? I came up with a list of maybe about 7 or 8 things that are pretty fundamental things about Christianity that faiths of the world cannot agree on. What would you include in that list? I mean, these are the things that are really going to get in the way if we say all religions are true at the same time. What is really going to get in the way of that statement being true?
Having the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day.
Okay.
Is that the type of thing that you're looking for? You're looking for more philosophy?
Maybe more at the kind of the higher level, philosophical level, but I think we can turn that into one of them, is what does God require of us to do? What does God expect in terms of worship, or what does God prescribe in terms of worship? Those are things that are clearly very different across various religions of the world. So that Margaret's example of the Lord's Supper being given as if we want to call it a sacrament of our faith, that differs a lot between different faiths. So I think that's one. What are the traits of worship?
Andrew,
Yeah.
you could look at Acts 17, see the comments made as they observed the temples in Athens. And God is not a God who dwells in temples made with hands. And I think that's a fairly persistent difference between world religions and the true God. Is the holy temple, the holy place, we understand is not made with hands. It is God dwells within the spiritual dwellings of the tents that He created, the hearts of men that are receptive, men and women receptive to Him.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty consistently not true of most other faiths that are more than just philosophies, because I think your distinctions can run into some issues when you're dealing with people that have more of a philosophical view than they do a religious view.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that's probably a consistent difference.
Okay. So maybe boiling that down to even a more simplistic way, the nature of God. What is God's nature? What is He like? Where can He be found? Those are things that you'll find are very, very different across different beliefs. Some of the Eastern faiths will say that God is not a person as much as He is an energy of the universe, or some force in the universe that can be communed with and can be contacted. Dan, were you going to say something?
I was say something along the same lines as God ceased direct revelation to mankind at roughly around at 100 AD. So he's active, but he's not actively revealing other than with the written word. So it's not something, a lot of people think, I was contacted, or, it's always the example of, well, Paul was saved on the road to Damascus. Well, no, he wasn't. He was contacted, yes, but he was not saved on the road to Damascus. So, they think that God is more interactive like that he's, they're looking for Him to talk to them directly as opposed to talking to them through His word.
Okay.
His written word.
So what are the activities of God, both in the past and today? So you'll find big differences in faiths that say that, either God is currently active today in ways that are more direct, in ways that can be channeled through people, or that He's not, that He never was. You'll find that difference in different faiths. Kind of along that lines, who God is. This is similar to who is God in His nature, but whether it is God in one person, that would be, the monotheistic faiths that we know, Judaism and Islam, they believe in God in one person. God is one, there are no other gods. We believe the same, but we believe the nature of God is slightly different, that He's one God in 3 persons. A Jew or a Muslim would say that's blasphemy to say that God is one in 3 persons. That Trinity nature is something that they reject. Along the same lines, what's the nature of man? Are we created by God? Are we gods ourselves? You will find faiths that will say that man is God, and that the goal of man is to become more and more like the gods that we are. These are things that, if these are all true at the same time, then each of these faiths start to make no sense when all of these things are true at the same time. Brace, were you going to say something?
It's not necessarily unique to Christianity, but it is different than most world religions. The idea that God wants to have a relationship with us is fairly unique. I mean, Judaism may agree with that concept in theory, but in most religions, God is more one who is we're to avoid offending and to avoid his wrath than the idea that we are somehow relational with him, that he cares about having any kind of a relationship with us. I think what I know about even Islam, I think would be more the idea of just avoiding God's wrath and trying to honor him so that he doesn't lash out against us as much as, not so much the idea of a relationship.
Okay. So the wanting of relationship, the personal connection of God, the desire for that personal relationship. Other things that I had written down was whether or not there is a deliverer. The presence of a deliverer also begs another question: what is sin? And is sin a problem that mankind has to overcome or not? There's faiths where sin is not really talked about. There are things that are less good to do and things that are more good to do, but there's not really this notion of sin that separates us from God. If you do more good than bad, you can be closer to God. This is the way a lot of religions operate. And what is salvation? The end, I think we alluded to this, but the end goal of many faiths, salvation means different things to different faiths. For some faiths, salvation is heaven. It's some kind of paradise that's not here on this earth. But for others, salvation is reincarnation. I want to have my spirit perpetuate in another life that's perhaps better than the one before, depending on how well I live this one. So all of these things are just, they do not work in compatibility with one another. And this all goes back to that notion we talked about on Wednesday, the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be what it is and what it isn't at the same time. So if the way to God is Jesus, it is Christianity, then it cannot also be all the things that it isn't. And that's the point we want to derive from all of this. So I hope that wasn't too much confusion thrown into the mix right there at the end. Any other closing thoughts on the exclusivity of Christianity? I don't have the sheet up here with me, so I can't remember the questions, whether we've covered them all in detail, but anything else people wanted to pull out or mention on this topic? Otherwise, we'll move to lesson 7. Go ahead, sir.
The only other thing I wanted to mention was the uniqueness of the Bible in comparison with other religious literature.
Mm-hmm.
Jews would fit into this category from the perspective of the fact that the Old Testament clearly we believe to also be the inspired Word of God, but every other religious text that's out there does not bear the same marks that the Scriptures do. And so, I mean, it is unique to Christianity that the Bible bears marks that no other word does, and by that evidence, honestly, reveals itself to be a book that's not from men.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is unique to Christianity.
Right. The span over which the Bible has been written is different than a lot of religious texts. Other religious works tend to be a singular work or a singular point in history where that text is compiled. But the Bible spans, I don't know what the total start to end gap in terms of timeline is. It's over 1,000 years, I think, if I'm not wrong. So the span of that work, and yet the unification of theme, the repetition of themes that are consistent across. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Gospels. The way writing styles would even change in that period of time, and yet an author who's writing in the New Testament can parallel the signs and the pictures and the imagery of the Old Testament and even Genesis, even all the way back to the beginning. That gets echoed throughout the text. And there's even more technical details maybe that Brace is alluding to, things like prophecy, where we know for a fact that these books come from well before the events they describe. We've found manuscripts that predate the fulfillment, and yet those prophecies find their fulfillment later on. That's a neat trick that other religious books are not very good at replicating. So I think that is a good point there. We probably could have spent a lot more time, maybe even a whole lesson or two, on just the textual evidence of the Bible alone. So I think that is a good point to bear out. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, we will switch gears now to lesson 6. And this kind of gets us into the part 3 of this entire class, and the last part of this entire class, which is addressing the arguments or the critiques of the skeptic. So I want in this section to kind of take questions or attacks that people might throw at Christianity, and how do we react when we hear some of those things. And just to intro this, I found here a quote. This was written in 1811 by Percy Shelley. He wrote a work called The Necessity of Atheism in 1811. Percy Shelley was married to, he's an English poet, and he was married to Mary Shelley. And if you know who Mary Shelley was, she wrote the book Frankenstein in the 1800s. So, husband to a popular British author and an English poet himself. He wrote this. This is what he says. "He is infinitely good. What reason should we have to fear him? If he is infinitely wise, why should we have doubts concerning our future? If he knows all, why warn him of our needs and fatigue him with our prayers? If he is everywhere, why erect temples to him? If he is just, why fear that he will punish the creatures that he has filled with weaknesses?" So he wrote here this sort of quick-fire series of questions of, well, if God is this, then how do you explain judgment if he created us with these flaws? How do you explain praying if he already knows everything? And the reason I wanted to read this is because it illustrates how, at this stage in the discussion, if you've talked to someone about the reasons for why they believe in the existence of God, maybe you've talked about evolution versus creation, maybe you've talked about the origins of the universe and how it begs a cause, it begs an initiating event. Maybe you've talked about all those things, but I feel like in this section, these are some of the questions that really do hold people back when it comes to, I'm not going to believe that Christianity stuff because why is there so much suffering in the world if God is good? That's the one we're going to talk about tonight. Why would I want to believe in all this Christianity stuff when Christians have done so many terrible things all through history? They've been such horrible people in past history or in recent history. There's pretty good examples people can point to of churches and Christians doing horrible, terrible things, and that holds people back. So this is what we want to get into. And I mentioned this earlier, and the offer still stands. You've got 2 weeks left, but the offer still stands. If you've heard some of these questions, or if there are these questions on your mind, come to me soon, hopefully, and I will do my best to get this into what we talk about, because I think it's valuable to go through these and really question these ourselves and see, well, can we craft answers for them? Not craft answers. Can we discern the answers from the things that we believe? The other key part of this, too, is identifying the assumptions that are made. What Shelley here says is, why would God punish the creatures that he has filled with weaknesses? What are some of the assumptions that statement makes that we might try to address? Or if God is everywhere, why erect temples to him? I think some of us would probably agree with that question, would we not? But there's an assumption made here, and it takes some clarification. If we can clarify the assumption, maybe we can reach a conclusion. All right, so getting started into lesson 6. The intro to the lesson here. The Christian faith tells of a God who is at the same time all-powerful and all-good. This commonly brings about the criticism that if such a God existed, he would not allow evil and suffering to exist. Thus, because evil and suffering do exist, God is either not all-powerful, he is not all-good, or he's non-existent. And I asked you to read Judges 6:13 and Habakkuk 1:2. Anybody who looked at those passages want to tell me what was kind of the common thread between those two?
Gideon and Habakkuk both wonder, why are bad things happening to your people? Why are we suffering in Gideon's day at the hands of Moab? And Habakkuk, why are we suffering at the hands of some of your own people who are evil and you're not doing anything about it?
Right. Right. So the question posed to God is, why is all this suffering and evil happening? Where are you? Where are you, God? When are you going to do something about this? How long are you going to delay in dealing with this and helping your people? Why do you think it's significant that the Bible includes messages and verses like these?
We feel like that sometimes, we feel.
Okay. Susan and Margaret both agree that reflects the human experience. That reflects the way that we feel. There is an awareness in Scripture of the things that pain us and the things that weigh on us. When we read the Bible, we don't read a book that we can't relate to. We're not reading something that, some alien entity wrote this and they don't know how our minds work and they don't know what we're going through, because this book is completely out of touch. This book completely bypasses what I'm feeling. It knows, and the Bible knows, and God knows. The Bible knows because God knows that He knows the human concern with pain and suffering. Dad, go ahead.
I think in more specificity, Habakkuk is an acknowledgement that these people earned everything they're going to get. This is at the hand of Assyria or the Chaldeans. And so first of all, the warning had already been given that calamity would fall, that your house would be barren, that your land would be desolate. But the second point, I think, is also important. When God talks about in verse 6, raising the Chaldeans, a fierce and impetuous people who march through the earth to seize dwelling places that are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. And I think that's the key in verse 7. This isn't of God. This kind of treatment of one nation to another is because their sense of morality and justice is what they want it to be. It's not based upon God's teachings, God's principles. So why would you expect them to behave in a godly manner toward you when that's not their motivation? So I think it answers that in kind of two perspectives.
Working through what you said there. So
that's saying that God gave the Chaldeans free will just like He does the Israelites.
Mhm.
The Israelites were warned of disobedience and what would befall them if they didn't align themselves with God's principles.
right.
So when that's being fulfilled, it's both a fulfillment of what was already prophesied, but secondly, God is using an instrument of man who has their own sense of justice. They're not administering justice in God's scheme. They're doing it based upon, and they're fierce, and they're to be feared because they're ruthless people. So that it has a lot more to say about the nature of fallen man than it does about the nature of God. I guess is my point.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for clarifying a little bit. And I would agree that, the Chaldeans reflect that this is an evil at the hand of man. It is coming from man. It is coming from a nation of people. However, Habakkuk says, how long is this going to go on? Why is this happening? Why is this a problem? God told them this was going to happen. And still, Habakkuk's cry to God is, why this suffering? Why this evil? I think it helps us to see that even when there's a reason, we still at times will say, I don't know why this is happening. I don't know why God would let this happen or let this continue on like He has. Even when we're given the reason sometimes, it's not out of the question that we would have those kinds of feelings. I think the Bible includes that to show us this is a human experience. This is a human reaction that Habakkuk is having. You had a hand up.
And I think it's significant that God's not afraid to deal with these questions and these feelings and these thoughts, but we are sometimes, because these kinds of questions make us uncomfortable and we don't feel like we can necessarily answer them effectively. But God's not afraid to deal with this. And not only do we see it in Judges and Habakkuk, but the Psalms are full of statements like this. People who are suffering, and sometimes they ask, where are you? When are you going to deal with this? And so God is not afraid to deal with our doubt and our struggles and all of that in some very real ways, which, as you said, helps us because we feel this way sometimes, but it also, like I said, I just think it's significant that God, I mean, within his word itself, addresses some of these feelings and thoughts. Doesn't always give a clear answer, but he does at least address them.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to.
Yeah. You remember the, what was it? The, it was one of those other things that had a term, and it just slipped me. The law of embarrassment, the condition of embarrassment or self-embarrassment. Why would God have reason to allow his Bible to question, where are you, God? You know, if I'm God and I'm writing my holy text, why would I even want to put that out there? Why would I even want to let that be read? You know, I don't want that to get out there. But God, like Brace said, he's not afraid of these kind of questions. And he's willing to show us that even his prophets, even Gideon, his loyal servants in times of trouble, they pose these questions and they feel these things. God records for us that Jesus said, "Why have you forsaken me?" on the cross. The Son of God expresses these laments and these cries in suffering to show us that he sympathizes with our weaknesses. And Jesus does for sure. Dan?
I was going to try to boil it down is in the world and observations is good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, but bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people.
Yep.
And God, throughout the scriptures, has shown us examples of all of those. And it's not always, you know, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Sometimes it's some of the evil kings in all of the Old Testament were, you know, prosperous. And I mean, look how evil Solomon really was, and the things that he allowed and even perpetuated in his kingdom. But yet, here he was, you know, as far as it goes, the wealthiest of all the kings of all time for Israel, and probably you want to call him the wisest. But even his book of Ecclesiastes, I mean, you know, including a book like Ecclesiastes in this Bible, it's just it's so far out of character of the rest of the religious world, because it shows the futility of a man's pursuits. And you know, it's just, there's all these things that seem like you're doing the right thing. You're choosing, you know, searching after more knowledge and more knowledge and more knowledge and more wealth, more wealth, more wealth. You're pursuing after these things, but there's no benefit. There's no gain in it. You know, vanity is the word to choose, but you know, it's like, you know, like beating at the wind. It's running into, you know, against the wind, whatever. So using all these things, the Bible has answers for a lot of things that we question, or at least, if not answers, it at least gives you illustrations of the same kinds of things happening to, you know, people that are recorded here.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Ecclesiastes is such a insightful inclusion into the Bible. And, you know, reading especially the first parts of the book, it almost sounds like the rantings of someone who's on the verge of losing their faith. I mean, parts of Ecclesiastes sound downright just apathetic or nihilistic. It's like, you know, well, might as well, you know, do your best, try to live your life, eat your bread, and do what you can, because it's all gonna go away. There's no point to any of it. There's portions of that book that seem incredibly pessimistic and incredibly devoid of seeing where God fits into all of this, and yet it's there, and it's there because that's something that God doesn't shy away from. He doesn't shy away from those emotions being there. Was there another hand that I missed? Okay. All right, so getting to the question then of, it's clear that suffering and pain exist. It's clear that that's part of our experience. It's part of everyone's experience. You don't have to believe in God, and everyone's going to say, yeah, bad things happen to people. That stuff just happens. So what does that say about God? The first question here, how would you answer the claim that the existence of suffering indicates that God is not all-powerful? If you say, there's evil and there's suffering in the world, so clearly God is not all-powerful. God is not in control if those things exist. First of all, what does that assume? There's a pretty big assumption in that statement.
It assumes that God doesn't act because he can't.
Okay, it assumes that God is incapable of doing something about the evil. I think it also bears the assumption that if he could, he would. If he could do something about it, surely God would prevent this from being the case. So let's talk about this for a little while. Just because God can do something, is that the same as saying he will do it or he does do it? And I think there's some interesting points. Did you have a hand up, sir? Okay. I wanted to read a couple of quotes here. These came from Francis Collins' book, but he's actually quoting C.S. Lewis in most of the portions that I saved out here. C.S. Lewis wrote an entire book entitled The Problem of Pain, and it's one of his more well-known works of apologetics, where he tackles this whole question. And he says that there is an argument that goes something like this. Lewis writes, "If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do whatever he wished. But the creatures are not happy, therefore God lacks either the goodness or the power or both." So that's the argument as we've had it laid before us. What's the first thing that we say to this? And I think Dad's already alluded to it when he was talking about the Chaldeans and the nature of Habakkuk. Some suffering and evil is man-made, is it not? I mean, we know that weapons are man-made, wars are man-made, bombs, knives, crime, drunk drivers hitting people, negligent parents, negligent caretakers, negligent architects who build bridges that collapse and kill people. Famines can be man-made. Genocides can be man-made. These are evil things and things where people suffer. But do we say that it is God who is doing these things, or is it humans that are doing these things? For these examples.
We see that it's humans. Now, somebody might argue that God's allowing it.
Right. So the distinction is that it is the action is directly stemming from an action of humans. There is some human action that leads to the suffering of another human, but we say that it's been allowed to happen by God. God's not acting on it himself, but he's allowing it to occur. They come from the freely chosen actions of man. And this brings up people having free will, right? So is free will the only explanation here? God's all powerful, but people have free will. Is that the only counter? Go ahead, Dad.
Well, no, it's not the only counter, because we're overlooking the fact that God has already relieved all pain, suffering, misery, and death. But he's done it through the action of his Son on the cross, rather than a direct divine intervention when mankind is acting in a foolish fashion. So it's a matter of timing, isn't it? Because hasn't God made opportunity for all men to be happy, all men to be in paradise, all of mankind to be redeemed from all of these things that we suffer today? God has done that. It's just not been manifested in our own experience. We don't see it come to life. We live it by faith.
Right.
I mean, that's already discounting that living a Christian life has its multiple advantages in this life. But my point is, when people say God hasn't done what he could have done to relieve suffering, he gave his only Son to relieve suffering. And you need to acknowledge that in the grand scheme of the universe, or the whole equation falls apart.
Well, be careful. I think it's worth taking care to say, what suffering did Jesus' sacrifice alleviate? Because Jesus dying on the cross doesn't make my pain any less painful if there's something that happens in my life. If some disaster befalls me and my life is in shambles because of it, gas line blows up and my house goes 200 feet in the air, and everyone in it, that's pretty devastating. And Jesus dying on the cross, how did that alleviate my suffering? So clarify there, what suffering is alleviated?
Well, the suffering in that's not the finality of life.
Right.
That's the finality of temporal things, but that's not the finality of our existence.
Right.
And so that's why I use the word timeline.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't acknowledge the timeline in which God alleviates all suffering, pain, disease, hunger, and death, then you're going to not get the correct answer when you try to solve the equation.
Yeah, the despair around suffering and why would God allow suffering to exist, that despair, I think, stems from our only known experience is this life and the time scale of this life and our lifetime. It's the same thing that plagued Habakkuk. It's the same thing that plagued Gideon. All they know is the time scale of this life. But what Dad's saying is, I agree with, is that we've got to make the very difficult jump to God doesn't think like we do, and God's plans do not look like our plans. When you have a being who is infinitely present and beyond time, his plans and intentions do not look like our lifetime. They do not look like the span of our lives. Joy?
Since you stole my point, I was going to say Isaiah 55, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. Whereas the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So those are the assumptions that we have all the answers, or we can get all the answers. Here's another verse. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with a child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So some of this is, I've been very guilty of making the assumption that I should have the answers, or that I deserve the answers, or I can eventually get those answers.
Okay. We can't know all of the ways in which God's working. We cannot fully discern the mind of God as it's happening because sometimes it's at a scale where we just can't even perceive what it is that we're seeing right there. It's like, for some reason, a part of a book that I read one time, there was a novel I read and there was a chapter that was describing an ant that was walking across a tombstone. And as the chapter progressed, it described the ant walking through each one of the letters, but it has no idea what's written on the stone. And the end of the chapter talks about, what's written on the stone. But when our span of vision is so short and so brief, we can't see the ultimate plans that God has in mind. I think that's a good point to mention. Did you have a hand up?
Ultimately, all suffering is the result of sin. I mean, it could be the result of the sin of Adam and Eve, and thus the fact that we live in a corrupted world because of sin. As you pointed out already, choices that we make that are sinful sometimes have immediate consequences that are temporal. And so we suffer the consequences for our own sinful choices. And then other people have free will choices in which they make sinful choices that result in not only their pain and suffering, but sometimes the pain and suffering of others.
Mm-hmm.
But sin is ultimately at the root of all suffering. Doesn't matter what kind of suffering we're talking about.
So I would agree that I think most people can see that makes sense when it comes to direct human action that is evil. A murderer committing that sin results in the suffering and the pain of someone else. That's an act of evil. How would you describe to someone that suffering and pain is a result of sin when it's something like a hurricane or an earthquake or a freak accident that occurs? What sin is the root cause of that suffering?
I mean, the only thing you could point to, and it doesn't point directly to a hurricane, but there were temporal consequences that resulted in the world that Adam and Eve were a part of because of the choice that they made in the garden. I mean, that they would have to work by the sweat of their brow, and that thorns and thistles the earth would bring forth, which seems to be the result of their choice and not something they previously would have had to have dealt with. And so I would say that all of those kinds of things, hurricanes, tornadoes, are all the result of that sinful choice. We live in a fallen world, the world that is different now than the world that God created in the beginning. And the environment that He had planned for us to live in seemingly forever had we not sinned. And like I said, hurricanes are not mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, but because of the other temporal consequences that resulted from that, and I think it's Romans 8, Paul talks about the creation itself groaning because of the sins of men and looking forward to the time when that that sin is removed and it is cleansed and made perfect. Speaking of the coming of Jesus and all that he brought forth. So again, I think it's fair to lump all suffering into sin as a whole. I'm not necessarily suffering immediately because of something I've done wrong, which is important for us to make a distinction in. But I am suffering because of sin. Mine or someone else's, it's ultimately somewhat irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. I also think it's important to point out that it's the height of arrogance for us to think that we should be spared from suffering when God did not allow his son to be spared from suffering. He suffered horrifically. And again, his suffering was the result of sin, only in his case, not his own, but ours.
Right. Yeah, I think, pointing to sin, so all of these things, they help us kind of in the final picture of what we might try to teach someone. Go ahead, Dan, and then I wanted to get to one more thing about free will before we ended on today, but go ahead.
How do we know the difference between, this is pleasurable if we didn't know pain? How do we know if, light versus dark, if they're good versus evil? All of the things that we experience are in comparison. Oh, this tastes really good, but this tastes sour and nasty. Those, the contrast is something that God has given us, because if we say, he says, I have a reward for you, I have rest for you, from your weary days. Well, if it's all pleasurable, and it's what do we need to rest from? What do we need to heaven for if everything was good on earth? So if God could make things, everything pleasurable, everything go back to paradise or Eden, we wouldn't, we couldn't handle it. From what Adam and Eve couldn't handle it. I don't know how long the period of time they were in the garden, just the two of them, or if it was just the two of them, but how long did they live in the garden? We don't know. But they couldn't handle it, so they needed to be shown, and they missed it because they were no longer there.
Yeah.
And so knowing, I said, it's kind of hard to put in words, but it's good versus bad. You don't know if something's good if you don't understand what's bad.
Certainly the contrast becomes more apparent. I think what you're getting to makes some good points about the question of really what is evil, and is evil a created thing? Is evil just the absence of good? There's been different answers to that questions from different people in the past, and I wanted to look at some of those, so we'll probably take a moment to look at that. I'm going to go a little over because I want to read this quote. We mentioned free will as being one of the things that leads to this suffering, and Lewis writes some more about this. I just wanted to give you this here. Should God have restrained our free will in order to prevent these kinds of evil behavior? Because if we're saying he's all-powerful, could he?
Sure.
He could. He could. Why not? Why not just do that? That line of thought quickly encounters a dilemma from which there is no rational escape. Again, Lewis states this clearly. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix them with two other words, God can. Nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God. So think about that statement. God made a creature with free will, and God overrides that free will to stop suffering from happening. That is something being what it is, and at the same time, what it isn't. It's not free will if God's overriding it to stop suffering from happening. And we hear these kind of paradoxes sometimes. Can God make an object so big he can't move it? Well, if he's all-powerful, he can, right? But then he can't. Or can God cause himself to no longer exist? Can God delete himself from existence because he's all-powerful? Those are questions that they're paradoxical statements. They're nonsensical statements because just because we say God can do something, that says nothing about the nature of what God is and what he does. All-powerful doesn't mean that God does the nonsensical. So that's what I wanted to share before we moved on. We'll continue on with this one on Wednesday. Thank you for your comments.